Hi, I'm Michael Apple for BizNews.com. It's a great pleasure to chat to Professor Anthony Butler, who's a professor of political studies at UCT. He's also an author of several books, including the biography Cyril Ramaphosa, The Road to Presidential Power. Prof, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
The Chief Justice Raymond Zondo set tongues wagging when he wrote in his final report that, quote, consideration be given to making the necessary constitutional amendments to ensure that the president of the country is elected directly by the people. You wrote a column recently explaining why this isn't a simple exercise and why it may not be the best idea.
Right. Yes, Michael. It's one of those ideas that sounds good at the time, but you have to understand that changing the system by which you elect a president is making a fundamental change to the system of government as a whole. So we tend to talk about two kinds of political systems in democracies: parliamentary and presidential. And South Africa has a parliamentary system in which there is a single center of sovereignty, which is the parliament of the country. So we vote for the people who represent us in the parliament, and it's up to them to choose the head of the executive branch, the head of the government. And also in our case, he also serves as the head of state. But it's a parliamentary system very similar to parliamentary systems elsewhere in the world. Now, a presidential system is something quite different. There, you deliberately have two separate elections. You elect your parliament or your legislature, which would more typically be called a congress, but you also have a separate election for the president. So you're deliberately creating a division between two centers of power within the political system, and you're having them elected separately. Now, that only makes sense if you're going to remove other elements of a parliamentary system. So, most obviously, you can't have a system in which you directly elect the president and then you allow the parliament to remove them through a no confidence vote. You can't have the constraint on where the president, who you've been through a process of electing, you can't have a constraint on where they choose their cabinet from in the way we do in our system. So in a presidential system, once you've elected the president, you're stuck with them, except in very exceptional circumstances where you might have an impeachment process. Now, do we want to make changes of that significance at all? And here I'd make a general point that is relevant to a whole range of amendments that are being proposed to our political system. We have people talking about constituency bases of elections, people talking about this process, in fact, of introducing the opportunity for so-called independent candidates to run for national and provincial office. All of these proposed changes, I think, are in themselves dangerous. And they're dangerous because, as we've seen in many countries around the world, including long-established democracies, the legitimacy of an electoral system is in part based on repetition and habit. So when somebody wants to dismantle an electoral system, to challenge the legitimacy of an election, perhaps because they're worried that they're going to lose or that they have lost, then it's very important that everyone is familiar with the electoral system, that we have a routine for dealing with controversy and contestation around elections. The more you change your electoral systems, the more complicated you make them, the more you create a situation in which it's possible to contest the outcomes of elections. And I would say that we're not in a place right now where we want to make the system more complex and contestable. But then there are specific reasons to be worried about a shift to a presidential system. Should I run through some of those, Michael?
Yes, please.
Well, I think we've seen in countries around the world, we've seen a new generation of populist leaders. And it hasn't just been in presidential systems, but certainly presidential systems seem to empower populists. So individuals who run a personal campaign, a campaign based around who they say they are and what they want within a society. Now, why is that a concern? Well, because in societies that are divided in different ways, there are all kinds of things, all kinds of bases on which an individual might wish to campaign for office. And we can imagine it might be a campaign organized around ethnic, racial, or religious divisions, or a campaign organized around xenophobia. Now, in a parliamentary system, it's much harder to campaign on the basis of emotion and topics that move people at the moment, because precisely the parliamentary system forces a leader to form broad alliances and consensus within their governing party, or of course more normally within a coalition, which is a situation towards which we're moving quite rapidly. We've also seen in lots of post-colonial African societies, we've seen parliamentary systems being converted to presidential ones. So you have a leader who feels under challenge from people within their own party, or they're running up against term limits, and they come up with the scheme of presidentializing their system. So they introduce a new election in which they personally can secure a mandate. And they use that mandate to change the constitution again, to remove term limits, to intimidate and override the parliament, which becomes a weakened body. Once you start having separate presidential elections, the focus of parliament is lost. The focus of politics around the legislature is weakened. People begin to do deals with the president. And that's interest groups, that's the people who buy politicians. They know who to buy. So I think there are a whole series of reasons why we should avoid change at all unless necessary, but also that we should avoid this particular change to a presidential system. And I must say, I keep thinking of the previous presidents that we've had, particularly Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, who were constrained by term limits, and both of their factions tried to continue after the presidential term limits had brought an end to their effective leadership. So Thabo Mbeki proposed to run the country from the Thule House after contesting to stay on as ANC leader. Jacob Zuma, I would say also his faction, made plans to continue in power after his removal from the office of state president. So here we're talking about palace elites, the incumbent factions. In a parliamentary system, the party can do the job of removing those people and those factions from power. And we've seen that in the case of both the Mbeki and Zuma factions. And we'll see it again when it comes to Ramaphosa. Through a parliamentary system, one of its great strengths is that the party can remove a leader if that leader is hoping to outstay their welcome or their faction is planning to do so.
So We've been grappling with this idea for, well, close on 20 years now, since the Zyl Slabbert Electoral Task Team report. That has been ignored. Remind us what that report recommended, Prof.
Right. So the task team was charged with the electoral task team. It's now 20 years ago, chaired by Frederick van Zyl Slabbert. It was tasked with reporting on the electoral system, which was viewed as provisional at the time the Constitution was finalized. And the task team was divided. So the majority report, which was supported by Slabbert, argued for a mixed system. So we would continue to have 400 MPs, and we would continue to have a fully proportional outcome, but in rather a clever institutional fix that borrows from electoral systems elsewhere, perhaps most obviously Germany. You would have multi-member constituencies. I think the majority report suggested around 70 multi-member constituencies. And people would vote in those constituencies for candidates who had some local relevance, some local constituency, some local basis for support. Now, that creates the possibility of a linkage between your representative in Parliament and your region or your locality. Remember, these are pretty big constituencies, but you can see that you might view an MP as belonging to you, somebody you might know about in your town or your city, or even in your rural area. Now, one of the problems with constituency-based systems is that they're disproportional. And that's particularly because small parties can't win any constituencies. They typically lose everywhere, so the votes for those parties are wasted. So the Slabbert majority report, it saved 100 MP seats as top-ups. So once you've allocated the 300 MPs on the basis of constituency votes, you then use the remaining top-ups, which will go overwhelmingly to smaller parties that weren't able to secure a constituency win. So that means that overall you would have proportionality between votes cast and the number of MPs elected. We can see there's an attraction to this system in that it tries to create some kind of link between an MP, even in quite a large multi-member constituency, and the constituents themselves. Now, the government rejected this, and it decided to remain with our current closed list proportional system without constituencies. Mm-hmm. And I think the argument is a balanced one, and I don't think that the majority report should be dismissed out of hand at all. My initial concern about whether now is a good time to change an electoral system when the electoral system, the electoral commission, is likely to be stress tested by a period of transition between majority government and coalition government. But beyond that, there are also dangers to constituency-based competition. So it's good in that you may be more likely to know who your MP is, or who the MPs are that represent your constituency. But on the other hand, we may find that the usual problems, the problems that arise in politics more broadly, also arise with our MPs. that although they are slightly closer to us, we still don't know if they're telling us the truth about what they've done right and what they've done wrong. In fact, we don't have very good systems at a local level for allowing us to understand what our politicians are doing. In fact, I think we could say those systems have weakened in recent years as a result of the collapse of many local media organizations, local newspapers, and so on. But also, constituency competition creates problems. One problem is that we have already a problem of breakdowns of party discipline. And you can see how that would get worse in a constituency-based system. Now, on the one hand, that's good if you think that the parties are purely doing wrong. So you want a breakdown of party discipline in the sense that people can rebel against their own party and complain that the government is acting corruptly or wrongly or incompetently. But on the other hand, there are many reasons why a constituency elected MP might want to go on their own. And that can include money politics once again. So we see in many constituency-based systems, we see MPs looking after the interests of rich and powerful interest groups within their constituency. So they try to bring government contracts to their constituents. At a more crude level, they bring money before elections to their constituency. But also we can find in constituency-based systems, if you imagine a particular area, you may find that a certain form of ethnic politics will take hold, or racial politics. So in order to win in a particular constituency, you might have to adopt a particular ethnic nationalism or chauvinist position in order to mobilize, to motivate local electors. Right now, the parties are the key instrument for containing that problem, at least in my view, that the parties try to prevent candidates from campaigning on ethnic grounds or racial grounds. A similar argument could be made about gender. So there's value, I believe, in the gender targets that most of our political parties have. It may well be that in a broadly patriarchal society, women as constituency candidates would have very limited success. So again, you can argue that that's democracy, but it's certainly a cost to strengthening the constituency system. And also we can see that one problem with constituency systems that we've found a good deal in other countries is that boundary demarcation becomes an issue. So right now in national and provincial elections, we don't have to worry overly much about problems of gerrymandering, trying to change boundaries to get people elected, trying to bus candidates from one place to another. But these might be problems that will grow where people are competing on a constituency basis. Now, my view, which I think also tilts me against the Slabbert Majority Report, is that we already have quite a complex electoral system, and local issues are addressed in local elections. And provincial issues are addressed to some degree in provincial elections. So national elections allow citizens to focus on clearly stated manifesto commitments of coherent political parties. And I think that's the strength of our system. I think that when you look at countries that don't have strong party systems, for example, in Latin America, you have a huge problem with making meaningful electoral choices. And I think we don't recognize the value of having three political parties, love them or not, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, and you could probably add the IFP to that. Political parties that have routines for selecting leaders and candidates, they have fairly clear policy programs. And that's actually a great strength to our system. And having personal contestation at different levels of government is, once again, quite a risk to take in a period of transition in our political system.
I want to ask about this issue specifically, in that the leadership contest will be hotting up in the ANC come December this year. Now, the National Executive Committee of the ANC has ruled that all leaders contesting senior positions need to disclose their funders. Is this a step in the right direction, or could this just be paying lip service to transparency that is needed, since, you know, the party or a faction of the party will control that process?
Well, I think there's an element of truth to both of these suggestions. And I think one difficulty is that the internal ANC elections are very expensive, and there have been very few controls over the way in which money is spent. And you can see that let's say, I think the best estimates are that the campaigns of both candidates in 2017 cost around 500 million rand. Now, at one end of the spending spectrum, you have legitimate expenses. So if you're having an election, the candidates and the slates of candidates need to campaign. So they need to travel around the country, they need to organize meetings. There are certain forms of campaigning that cost money. And that can also include the expenses that on social media campaigning, on organization, on T-shirts and so on. And those kinds of legitimate expenses, there needs to be space for them. But I think the ANC would prefer to minimize those expenses rather than to see them growing. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have a lot of expenses that are really off the books completely. At the far end of the spectrum, there's money that is raised in the provinces or even locally. And those campaign funds can be used for all kinds of processes, including vote buying. The further you get away from the center of the campaign, the more irregular the fundraising and the more irregular the expenditure. And I think we've had some clues as to where the money comes from on both sides. And I think that we saw in 2017 that established businesses backed Ramaphosa with a lot of money. Most of that money went to the center, and much of it was spent legitimately, but it was still a very expensive election, and it was unclear why we would want to see large established businesses as key influences on the outcomes of internal ANC elections. At the other end, we saw the Dlamini Zuma campaign. We had, I think, we've had confirmation that funding came from many sources for that campaign, including from business people and from parastatals. And once again, the expenditure of that money, we know that some of it may have been legitimate expenses for busing and housing provincial delegations and so on, but we can be also confident that much of it wasn't. So too much of the ANC's electoral process is oriented around resources, and most of that is under the radar. So there is an argument for trying to bring greater regulation to those internal elections. And I think that nominally this is what the ANC has said it's doing. But clearly the faction that controls the machinery of regulation is going to be placed in a powerful position, an advantageous position. Mm-hmm. So in order to contest a national election in the ANC, with this election coming up in December, you need organization and you need resources. The harder it is to muster those resources, the more easily your organization is disrupted, the worse the situation you're in, the less viable is a campaign to displace the incumbent faction. And it's one reason why, other than Mandela's decision to resign after one term, it's one reason that we have seen a pattern of two-term presidencies. The complexity and the resources needed to run after the end of a first term are massive. And much of those resources has to be in the form of cash. And that cash may be used for partially legitimate purposes, for example, running social media campaigns nationally, but it may also be used for the most illegitimate purposes, such as vote buying. So my view is that tighter regulation benefits the incumbents at the expense of potential challenges.
Speaking about 2024, I recently interviewed Professor Jonathan Jansen, who says, quote, "We need to vote the buggers out of power." Do you see the rise of coalition government on a national scale in 2024, and how much maturity will that require? And do we have that maturity?
Well, we already have a fair amount of coalition government. And so far, it's been managed reasonably well. And I think that there are perhaps there are different ways in which coalition government might work out. And I think we have already seen that the ANC is weakened most in the more urban provinces, which are also the center of economic activity. And this is a concern for the ANC, but also for the political system as a whole, that if the ANC becomes increasingly centered around the politics of poorer provinces, and it loses power in the centers of the economy and the urban centers of the country, there's going to be a growing tension, a tension that's already in place, but a growing tension between the largest political party, which the ANC is likely to remain for some time, and the system of government, and what's good for the management of a flourishing economy, particularly in urban areas. Coalitions are also problematic, or complex at least, because of the nature of our party system. I think sometimes we imagine that our political parties are a little bit like political parties in the United Kingdom or established Western democracies. And we've seen even in those countries, there's a huge fluidity in the party systems. Most recently and visibly in the French elections, in the French case. So long-standing political parties have collapsed and been replaced by new formations. But here we have a party system that has been organized around what is sometimes called the Congress model. so named for the Indian Congress, the Indian National Congress, that was the dominant party in post-independence India for several decades. And the Congress system is different to a classical Western parliamentary system in that many of the political parties are essentially external factions of the mother body, of the governing party. So in our case, we can see that with the economic freedom fighters. So the EFF is more than simply a natural coalition partner for the ANC. It's also, I would say, essentially a faction. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be able to rejoin with the ANC to negotiate terms for such a deal, but it's certainly something that we should be aware of, that if the ANC becomes a minority party at national level and in the most important province from its point of view, Gauteng, then a coalition deal with its natural coalition partner, the EFF, strikes me as very likely. Electors won't like that, because if you voted for the EFF because you want to get rid of the ANC and they then jump into bed with them, they're not going to vote for you so happily next time. But you can play this game at least once. And my interactions with ANC politicians suggest to me that the younger the politicians are, the more open they are to exactly such a deal. And I don't think that's what many people are anticipating when they talk about coalition government. I should say that I think something similar is afoot with opposition parties. So to me, I look at the party Action SA, which is really a regional party at the moment, but they're going to try to field candidates around the country. Action SA is very much an offshoot of the DA and very much a natural coalition partner of the DA. Right, so it may well be that when you strip out these externalized factions, the party system maybe hasn't changed as much as we think. That under conditions of coalition politics, these external factions may move back to their initial starting point. So from the perspective of the EFF, this means that they would hold the balance of power, the ability to turn a minority ANC into a majority coalition. And that would give them immense leverage. So they would be able to secure for themselves many advantages, personal and for their faction. So coalitions may not quickly lead us to a radical change in our political system.
You wrote a biography on President Ramaphosa, Prof. Are you surprised by how his presidency is going? I hate to jump tact so quickly, but I think it's a question a lot of South Africans would like an answer to.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of disappointment with the first term of Ramaphosa. And there was some attempt to manage expectations and to suggest that the room for maneuver of the new president would be constrained by internal ANC politics. And I do think that there is truth to that claim. I suppose what we will have to look out for is what happens after the December conference. So although I can see some scenarios under which Ramaphosa might not be re-elected ANC president, certainly The overwhelming likelihood is that he will be. And then he'll be in a particularly unconstrained position from the perspective of the ANC as a center of power, as it likes to view itself. So if Ramaphosa comes back from the December conference, he arrives in January, and he has a plan, and he has a set of fresh cabinet appointments. He has a series of priorities for reform that he then advances rapidly. In our system of government, there's very little the ANC can do to stop him. I have doubts that he has such a plan, that there are, to him and to people around him, acceptable teams of people who can be brought in to drive a reform agenda. I think there's an underlying equivocation about the reform agenda. And we may well see more of the same, more negotiation and more entrenched engagement with vested interests. But I'm an optimist about this issue. And I think despite Ramaphosa's fairly long period in office, it has been a difficult time for other reasons, including the constraints imposed by the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout from that. So I'm waiting to see what comes after December.
Yeah, I think all South Africans are waiting to see what comes after December and whether there is going to be any decisive action from the president. Professor Anthony Butler, thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks, Michael.